It wasn't the divorce papers, or the cold silence that hung in the air the day I returned home that first tipped me off. It wasn't even the way the house felt strangely empty, almost as if someone had been here, but was now gone. Number. It was the note. I had been away for months. Routine. Another mission. Another war zone. You get used to the distance, to the absence of normality. But the moment I stepped through the door, I realized something was wrong. The scent of her perfume wasn't there, the sound of her laughter, those little things I took for granted, were all gone. I found it on the kitchen counter, next to an empty coffee cup. A simple note, hastily scribbled. "I'm leaving for someone else. Don't look for me." It hit me like a freight train, yet I didn't feel the immediate rush of anger I expected. Instead, I felt numb. The way you feel when you've lost something so big that your mind refuses to accept it, so it shuts down, keeps you in some strange state of denial. I stared at the words for a long time, my hand clenched into a fist at my side. My first instinct should have been to throw the note into the trash to slam my fist into something. But no, I stood there, motionless. It was almost as if the words didn't matter anymore. A Marine is taught to keep his composure, no matter the circumstances. And so I did. But inside, something was breaking. I knew it. I could feel it. This wasn't the first time she had pulled away. I had seen the subtle signs, the distant glances, the lack of warmth. But I never thought it would end like this. Not like this. I put the note back on the counter and stood still for a few moments longer, trying to piece together any logic that would make sense of this. But there was nothing. I couldn't let her leave like this. I needed to understand. I needed answers. Without making a sound, I walked to the bedroom, gathering my things. Her clothes were still there, folded neatly in drawers, but her side of the bed was empty. I checked the closet, the bathroom, even under the sink. Nothing had changed. It was as if she had just disappeared, as if she was a ghost. I knew I had to find her. But I couldn't do it the way I used to, with brute force and rage. No, this time I had to be calculated. I had to think. As I stepped out of the house and into the cool night air, I began to formulate a plan. I would find her, wherever she was, and I would discover the truth. But deep down, I knew something was off. There was a feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that I wasn't just looking for a wife who had grown tired of me. No, this was something more. There were secrets hidden beneath the surface, things that no one was telling me. As I started the engine of my truck and pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a sharp turn, and that it wasn't going to go back to how it was. The path ahead would be long, but I would follow it to its end, no matter what. There were answers I needed, and I was going to get them. I had to admit it. I was no longer in control, at least not the way I used to be. The Marine in me wanted to tackle this head-on, to barrel through it with strength and decisiveness. But this wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't some enemy I could defeat with sheer force. This was my life, my marriage, crumbling right before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I had a feeling that something wasn't right. The note didn't sit well with me, and the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. If she was leaving me, then why no warning? Why not tell me in person, after everything we had been through? No, this wasn't just a woman growing tired of her husband. Something else was going on, something deeper than that. It had been a long time since I had been this unsure of myself, but I couldn't afford to doubt. Not now. I needed to act. The first step was to figure out where she had gone. I had to trace her movements, check for any patterns that might lead me to her. My military training kicked in immediately. My mind started sorting through possible leads, thinking through everything she could have left behind. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew me too well, knew I would try to track her down, but I had to try. I started with her phone. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it was a start. I knew she had a tendency to leave her phone charging in the kitchen or on the couch when she was at home, so I checked the places where I knew it was most likely to be. Nothing. It wasn't there. I had a feeling she had taken it with her, which meant she was cutting ties in a way I didn't understand. Next, I turned to her social media. I wasn't a big fan of social media, too many eyes on you all the time, but it was another avenue to explore. I checked her Facebook, her Instagram. She hadn't posted anything in days. No photos, no updates, no sign of life. Just like the house. Empty. But it was the small things I started noticing that seemed out of place. A message I found on her laptop, hidden in an old email folder. It wasn't much, a vague conversation with someone named T. The messages were cryptic, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. She had been in contact with someone, and from the tone of their messages, it wasn't a friendly chat. I couldn't help but feel that she had already made her decision before the note. This wasn't a sudden thing. It was planned, and someone else was involved. I couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. The Marine in me wanted to dismiss it all, just find her, confront her, and move on. But this was different. The stakes were higher. I had to be careful. I couldn't charge in blind. I spent the next few days trying to gather more information, making subtle inquiries with people who might know something. I reached out to her friends, to some of her family, pretending to be concerned. I didn't want to give myself away, didn't want them to know that I was starting to unravel her life like a tightly wound thread. And then a breakthrough came. One of her old friends, a woman named Kelly, slipped up. She mentioned how John had been a great support to her lately, how she was grateful for him. I'd never heard of a John before. I pressed her for more details, but she was quick to change the subject. Too quick. That was it. There was a John, a man I didn't know about. And if this was the person who had been supporting her, the person she was turning to while I was away, then I was dealing with more than just a failed marriage. This was betrayal, and it was worse than I'd imagined. I knew it was time to dig deeper. I couldn't let this man slip away into the shadows. I needed to find out everything about him. And if he was involved in tearing my life apart, I would find a way to make sure he knew that I wasn't just going to walk away from this quietly. I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for revenge. The following days were a blur of tense moments and quiet determination. I couldn't afford to show weakness, not to anyone. I kept up the appearances at work. I kept my Marine composure, but inside the tension was building. I had already started digging into John, this mystery man who had somehow slipped into my life without my knowledge. He was the missing piece of the puzzle, the one who had likely played a part in this catastrophic shift in my world. I spent hours on the phone, checking social media profiles, looking for any scraps of information that would give me more insight. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the thought of her with him haunted me. How long had this been going on? What did they talk about when I was away? What had she said about me when I wasn't there to defend myself? But I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me. I had to think like a soldier, stay cool. I couldn't afford to make any missteps. I finally found a lead. It was a number, buried in the depths of her old phone messages. A name attached to it. John Stevens. Not exactly a common name, but still, I knew I had to find him. He was my target now. The first time I tried to search for him, I drew a blank. John Stevens was an incredibly common name, and there were thousands of them across the country. But I knew where he lived. Kelly had been careless when she mentioned his address during a conversation, and though she had tried to backpedal, I had already written it down. It was in the next town over, a small, unremarkable place, the kind of town where no one asks questions and everyone knows your business, if you're from there. I didn't want to go alone. This wasn't just a search for answers anymore. This had become a mission to uncover the truth about my wife's betrayal. So I did the only thing that made sense. I called in a favor. I reached out to a fellow Marine, a friend I had served with during some of the toughest deployments. Jack was sharp, methodical, and he understood the need for discretion. He agreed to meet me at a local diner where we could talk about the plan. We sat down in a quiet booth, The air smelled faintly of coffee and grease, but I didn't care. I laid out everything: my wife's sudden disappearance, the note, the cryptic message, the name John Stevens. Jack listened carefully, nodding as he processed the information. He was no stranger to dealing with delicate situations, but even he could sense that something wasn't right about this. "We'll approach it slow," Jack said, leaning in. "No sudden moves. We're not looking for confrontation, yet. Let's get the lay of the land first, then we can figure out what we're dealing with." I agreed. Patience. I had to learn to be patient if I was going to get the answers I needed. And I would get them. The next morning, we drove to the town. As we pulled into the quiet suburban streets, I felt a strange weight on my chest. This was it. This was the place where she had likely started over, without me. John Stevens's house was easy enough to find. A modest, two-story home on the outskirts of town, tucked between two larger, more ostentatious homes. It didn't look like much, but appearances were deceiving. Jack and I parked down the street, out of sight, and observed. For hours, we sat in the car, waiting for any sign of movement, anything that could point us in the right direction. Around noon, a man left the house, tall, wearing a plain baseball cap and a dark jacket. He moved like someone who didn't want to be noticed. That was him, John Stevens. I could feel the anger start to rise in me, but I pushed it down. I had to stay focused. This wasn't just about confronting him. It was about getting the truth, about understanding why my wife had left, and how this man had become part of that. We watched him for a while longer, noting his routine, the way he carried himself. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at his phone, constantly checking it like he was waiting for something. Or someone. I didn't speak for a long time, letting the silence linger between Jack and me. When I finally did, my voice was low, steady. "This isn't just some affair, Jack. This is something bigger. I can feel it." Jack didn't respond right away. He just looked at me with those knowing eyes, as if he understood exactly what I meant. He'd been through the trenches, both literal and figurative. He knew that when you're in a battle this personal, you can't afford to make mistakes. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Jack said, his voice steady. "We'll find out what's going on, but we do it smart. No recklessness." I nodded. He was right. I had to keep my head on straight. This was just the beginning. And I had no idea what I would find when we finally confronted John Stevens. But one thing was for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. The hours I spent in that car, watching John Stevens, felt like days. The longer I watched him, the more I began to see the cracks in his ordinary life. There were patterns in the way he moved, in the way he interacted with people. He wasn't as slick as he thought he was. And the more I observed, the more I understood. This man was hiding something. I had spent my entire career learning how to spot these patterns, how to notice the tiniest inconsistencies in behavior that others might miss. This was no different, and what I saw was something that didn't sit right. At around 4 p.m., he came out of the house again. This time, he didn't head for his car like he had done earlier. Instead, he walked briskly down the street, his phone held tightly in his hand. I didn't wait for him to get too far before I motioned for Jack to follow me. "Stay behind me," I whispered, my voice calm but intense. "We're just going to talk to him. See what he knows." Jack gave me a nod, his eyes locked on the target, and we began to follow at a discreet distance. We had to be careful. I knew if we startled him, things could go sideways fast. John turned a corner and entered a coffee shop on the corner. I couldn't help but feel a flash of annoyance. Why was he acting like everything was so normal? As if he hadn't torn my life apart in the process. We waited for a few minutes before I made my move. I entered the coffee shop, forcing myself to take slow, deliberate steps. I didn't want to give away my hand. And then I saw him. He was sitting at a corner table, sipping his coffee, completely unaware that his life was about to change. I walked straight to him, my boots clicking on the wooden floor with every step. He glanced up just as I reached his table, and for a moment, he froze. His eyes widened in recognition, and then narrowed as he tried to process who I was. "John Stevens?" I asked, my voice low but steady. His face flickered with something I couldn't place. Guilt, maybe? But it was gone in an instant, replaced with a forced, polite smile. "Yeah? Can I help you?" He didn't stand up, didn't offer me a handshake. He was defensive, but trying to keep it hidden. A sure sign he was uncomfortable. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, not waiting for an invitation. Jack was standing by the door, watching from a distance. He knew I was handling this, but he also knew that I wouldn't hesitate if things took a dangerous turn. "I'm James Carter," I said, keeping my voice even. "I think you already know that. My wife, well, she left me with a note, said she was leaving for someone else." I leaned in a little, watching for any sign of a reaction. "That someone else wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" John's face turned pale. It wasn't subtle, either. He swallowed hard, and his hand twitched as if he wanted to reach for his phone but thought better of it. "I think you've got the wrong idea," he said, his voice tight. "I don't know who—" "Cut the crap," I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. "I've been watching you for days, John. You're not fooling anyone. I'm here to figure out what the hell happened, and I know you know more than you're letting on." He didn't respond right away, just stared at me, weighing his options. I knew that he was trying to decide whether to lie to my face or tell me the truth. I wasn't sure which would be worse for him. Finally, he sighed, looking away. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Too late for that," I said, leaning back. "So, you've been seeing my wife behind my back. That's how it is." John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He was stalling, buying time, but I could see the guilt written all over his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself. She was just looking for someone to talk to. We were friends at first, but things just happened." I watched him, not saying a word. The silence hung between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I asked finally, my voice low. "That you were just friends? You knew she was married to me. You knew what you were doing." He looked away, his fingers twitching nervously. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but she wasn't happy, okay? She needed someone, and I was there." I could feel my jaw tighten as I listened to him. There it was, the justification, the excuses, the same words people always use when they're caught in a lie. "You're a coward," I said, standing up. "You don't deserve to be anywhere near her." John opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't wait for him to finish. I turned and walked out, feeling the weight of my anger settle into the pit of my stomach. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, Jack was already there, waiting by the door. He said nothing, just watched me, knowing that I had gotten what I needed. "Let's go," I said, my voice cold. "We'll handle the rest later." The confrontation with John was just the first step in what was going to be a long road. I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction from it. I didn't feel any relief, either. What I did feel, though, was a growing certainty. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The confrontation with John Stevens hadn't brought the clarity I was expecting. Instead, it had only added more confusion to the already tangled mess that was my life. I had gotten the truth, but it wasn't the kind of truth that set me free. If anything, it only weighed heavier on my shoulders. I'd always known there was something off about my wife's behavior in the months leading up to this. But now, seeing it laid out in front of me, hearing it from him, the man who had, in his own words, been there for her, it felt like a betrayal on a deeper level than I could have imagined. But what was worse was the way he had justified it, the way he acted as though he had done nothing wrong. It wasn't just about him and her anymore, it was about everything. The years I had spent away from home, the sacrifices I had made. All the while she had slipped away, looking for comfort in someone else's arms. We drove back to the hotel in silence. Jack didn't ask any questions, didn't try to offer comfort. He didn't need to. He knew the kind of person I was, and he knew that no amount of words could change what I had just learned. I barely slept that night. Thoughts swirled in my mind like a tornado, each one more overwhelming than the last. I kept picturing her face, the look in her eyes when she told me she was leaving. How calm she had been, how indifferent. It was almost like she had already made peace with the decision long before I had any idea what was going on. I couldn't let go of it. Not yet. Not until I understood everything. I needed to know why. Why had she gone this far? Why had she chosen him? The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. I wasn't going to confront John again. That would get me nowhere. But there was something I could do. I could dig into the details of her life that I had missed. The things she hadn't shared with me. I spent the day going through her belongings. I went through her journals, her emails, anything that might give me an idea of what had been going on in her mind. I needed to see the full picture, not just the pieces I'd been given. And that's when I found it. Hidden in the back of a drawer in her study was a letter, tucked away in an envelope. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. I opened it slowly, my hands shaking slightly as I read the words on the page. James, I know I've been distant lately, and I know you've noticed. But I don't know how to say this. I've met someone who makes me feel alive in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. I know this will hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I don't think I can keep pretending. I've thought about it for months now, and I think it's time for me to go. I want something different, something that's just mine. I hope you can understand. Julia. The words were like a punch to the gut. It was the same thing she had said to me, only this time I saw it in black and white. I had known. I had always known something wasn't right, but seeing it written out, her admitting it, confessing that she had already made up her mind long before the note was left on the kitchen counter, it was like a dam breaking inside of me. I read the letter again, my heart pounding in my chest. She had been planning this for months, not just a sudden decision after a fight or a passing thought. No, this was a well-thought-out escape. And she had chosen him over everything we had built. It was hard to breathe. It was hard to think. I wanted to throw the letter across the room to rip it into 1,000 pieces, but I didn't. Instead, I held on to it, feeling the weight of every word. It wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of everything I thought I knew about her. About us. For a while, I just sat there, the letter in my hands, unable to move. The anger was starting to creep in, slowly but surely. But underneath it, there was something else. Something colder. Betrayal. Deep, raw betrayal. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't stay in this place where everything reminded me of her. I needed to move on. I needed to take control of this situation to stop feeling like a victim and start being the one who called the shots. The hotel room felt too small. The walls felt too close. I got up, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. I needed to get out, to clear my head. I drove aimlessly, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stay. The open road was all I needed, just the sound of the engine, the road stretching out before me, and the silence in my mind. The silence that was finally starting to feel like peace. It wasn't the kind of peace I had expected, but it was peace nonetheless. And then, for the first time in days, I thought about the future, about what came next. About how, maybe, just maybe, I could leave all of this behind. The open road didn't offer the solace I'd hoped for, but it did give me space. The longer I drove, the more I realized something. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Julia, or the betrayal, or the sudden disappearance. It was about me. I'd been so focused on everything she had taken from me that I hadn't stopped to think about what I still had. What I could still rebuild. I drove for hours, the landscape blurring into a haze of trees and fields. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. The miles kept me moving, kept me distracted. But at some point, I had to stop. I had to face this. I pulled over at a small diner off the highway. The place was empty except for a few truckers sitting at the counter, their conversations low and muffled. I took a seat at the back, away from the windows, needing some quiet. The waitress came over and set down a cup of coffee in front of me without saying a word. I didn't have the energy to make small talk. I just needed to sit and think. As I sipped the coffee, the thoughts swirled in my mind again. The letter, John, Julia. It was all too much, too fast, and yet it was all happening so slowly, like a creeping poison that had taken hold of everything I knew. I'd spent so much of my life running, escaping, and fighting wars. But this was a war I couldn't win by brute force. It wasn't something I could solve by throwing myself into my work or my military training. This wasn't a battlefield. I needed answers. I needed to know more about John, about why Julia had chosen him, why he was the one who made her feel alive. Was it really about him? Or had I been the one who failed her? The question haunted me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was about more than just a man. This was about me not being there. Me choosing a life that required me to be away from home, away from her, for long stretches of time. Was that why she left? Had I given her the space she needed to fall into someone else's arms? Was this my fault? I had spent so long blaming her, blaming John, that I had never once looked inward, never asked myself the hard questions. And as much as it pained me, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding them. The waitress refilled my coffee and I took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through me. Maybe I couldn't undo the past, but I could control what happened next. I could choose to let go of the anger, the resentment, the blame. Or I could keep it. I could hold on to it like a weapon, letting it fester until it consumed me. But that wasn't the way forward. I pulled out my phone, opened the Notes app, and began to write. Not a letter to Julia, not a message to John, but something for me, a reminder of who I was before all of this, the man who could rise above the pain, the man who could still find purpose, even in the ashes of everything he thought he knew. I am not a victim, I typed slowly. I am not my past. I am not the man who gave everything to a marriage that fell apart. I am more than that. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was something I could hold on to, something that could help me move forward. Maybe I didn't have all the answers, but I could still choose to rebuild. I could still choose to live. I put the phone down and looked out the window. The sky was clear, the sun setting low on the horizon. It felt like a new beginning. Not the kind I had imagined, not the kind I had wanted, but a new beginning nonetheless. I paid for my coffee and stood up, stepping back into the world that had been waiting for me. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I no longer felt as though I was walking it alone. The truth had hit me hard, but now I had to find my way forward. The next few days were a blur. I didn't know where to go, what to do, or who to turn to. I'd spent so long running, fighting battles and burying myself in work that I'd forgotten what it meant to face my own reality. But now, the truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't look away. I took a few days off from everything. No calls, no plans, just time for me. I went to the beach, one of those places I used to go when I needed to clear my head. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, and yet it still felt like home. The waves crashed in the distance and the salty air filled my lungs. I walked along the shoreline, letting the sand sift through my fingers. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I finally understood. I wasn't going to get answers from Julia. I wasn't going to get closure from John. But what I could do, what I needed to do, was take back control of my own life. I had spent so long focusing on what was wrong that I hadn't allowed myself to see what was still good. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but I knew I was starting to let go of the anger. The betrayal wasn't the end of me. It was a painful chapter, but it didn't define who I was. As I stood there, looking out at the horizon, I made a vow to myself. I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to become a shadow of the man I used to be. There was a future waiting for me. And it wasn't with Julia. It wasn't with John. It was mine, and I was going to take it back. The weeks that followed were the hardest I'd ever faced, but they also became the most transformative. I returned to the routine, slowly, but with a different mindset. The military discipline I had lived by for so long was no longer enough to carry me through this. What I needed now was something deeper, a reason to keep going, beyond the bitterness of betrayal. I started focusing on myself, rebuilding the parts of me that had been neglected. I got back into training, not because I had to, but because it felt good to be in control of something again. The gym became my sanctuary. The weights didn't ask questions. They didn't betray me. They just were. And that simplicity brought me peace. I also reconnected with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. They were the ones who reminded me of who I was before all of this, the man who could stand tall, no matter the odds. I needed that reminder. I needed to remember that I was more than the sum of my failures. I wasn't defined by Julia's departure or John's role in it. I was defined by how I responded, by what I chose to do next. I didn't try to track Julia down again. I knew she had moved on, and I had to let her go. No more chasing answers. The truth was clear enough now. She had made her choice, and I had to make mine. I chose to move forward. And so I did. Little by little, I reclaimed my life. I went back to my roots, to the parts of me that had been buried under the weight of duty and sacrifice. I found new purpose, not in revenge, but in healing. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but it became bearable. And with time, it even began to fade into the background, no longer the loudest voice in my head. There was more to life than the past, more than what had been taken from me. I never saw John Stevens again. And Julia? Well, she was a chapter that had closed, and I wasn't going to reopen it. The past had its hold on me for far too long, but it was time to let go. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while I felt like I could walk it, not just survive it. I was free, and that freedom was all I needed to start over.